Hello, welcome. I hope your day is going well, and I hope you're enjoying this CloudEight virtual event. My name is Brian Reed, and we're going to look in this session at how to secure your mail flow. We're going to be looking at the problems that people have with email for security and authentication that is specific, let's say, to today. Okay, so we're not going to talk about how you should have secured it 10 years ago. I see a lot of people are still doing the technologies they did 10 years ago today and having problems. So we're going to look at what you should be doing now about the problems that you get with email. Email is an open protocol. There's no authentication or the ability to send or prove who you are with email. That's been added subsequent to it, but it's not built into the core protocol, and so it is abused and misused. From a business perspective, we'll look at how email authentication fails and why that's a problem. Impersonation and spoofing, so making things look like that's from someone but they're not. Okay. And then how email could be intercepted and modified en route where there's no message encryption because changes have happened over time and encryption was working, now it's not, you're not aware that it's changed, or it never was in the first place because it appears to be too complicated to set up. Okay. So as I say, my name is Brian Reed. I'm a Microsoft 365 consultant, Microsoft Exchange Service Certified Master and MVP. I'm based out of the United Kingdom. Let's have a look at our three major topics. Okay. So our first topic here is email authentication failures. Okay. So when we send email, we trust that it's going to arrive, and we trust that when it arrives, the people think that I sent it. Okay. Email authentication is the ability to associate with a received email that the sender really was who the sender was. Now, we're not talking here about things like SMIME, which could be used for that. This is at a more structural, a more base level to do with all the email that I send and receive. Okay? I want people to know that it came from me and it wasn't spoofed or impersonated, which we'll get on to next. There are technologies called SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and we'll talk about them in detail and what you should be doing about putting those in place. And when they're in place, we'll act as both the sender, we send the email, and we'll act as both the recipient, we receive the email, and how those technologies have an influence in those two environments. Okay. We will look at impersonation and spoofing. That's where the email claims to come from, let's say me in this case, but doesn't. It comes from someone who looks like me, who is pretending to be me. Okay. So for example, impersonation will send it from a domain that looks like my domain. So for example, my domain and my email address, brian@nbconsult.co. Well, let's say you received an email from brian@nbconsult.com. I don't own .com, somebody else does. Let's say they sent an email to you from the local part address, brian@. You might think it's me. You have a email relationship with me, so you get something that looks like it's from me. Okay. Not saying anything about the person who currently does own nbconsult.com, but as an example, it looks similar to. Or somebody could buy nbc0salt.co. Okay. You might not notice the zero rather than the O. Okay. A domain is theirs. They send it and they can do things like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. It's a legitimate domain. It's just not me. And so when you receive email from me and then receive email from the impersonator, your cloud filter, your technology that protects your domains wants to tell you that this is an impersonation and it isn't the person that you think it is. And then spoofing, that's where we actually change things. We get real emails and we modify them, or maybe we do account takeover. We take over an account and send email as that person. It's not the real person. And we make it look like me. So we look at it says brian@nbconsult.co as the sender, maybe because my mailbox has been compromised, hopefully not, or it doesn't actually come from that, it comes from someone else, and technologies have been used to hide the real email address. Okay. But from a user perspective, impersonation, spoofing, we can treat them as the same thing. And then for message encryption, if the message is not encrypted, there's always the possibility someone could modify the message en route. Okay. And with the current push to move to TLS 1.2, we have scenarios like Office 365, for example, which will only communicate with TLS 1.2. And it's beginning to turn that on across a number of services over the last couple of years. If you're running an older TLS or SSL technology and your devices don't do TLS 1.2, If you can't do TLS 1.2 to Office 365, then you'll do clear text for email. So where you thought you were secure, or where you've got certificates and you are, oh, we're secure, actually you're not, because your technology is out of date. And so we can make sure that that's in place as well. So that's our summary of what we're going to look at today. And we're going to start off from the viewpoint of the sender. So we're going to fix this from the sender's perspective. Okay. So the risks are, as we said, I can send something and someone thinks that it is me, but it's not me. Okay. We as the domain owner want to protect the assets of our company. We've got to make sure that what we are saying we are doing and who we are is represented correctly within the world at large into which we communicate. It would be seen as remiss or bad practice not to do that. Problem is we have lots of people who will not set their authentication policies up correctly or don't understand email authentication and therefore put it off for another day. I'm going to help you today. We're going to talk about how actually some of this is quite easy to do to start with. Okay. But you do need a good understanding of the sender policy framework, which is SPF, domain keys identified mail or DKIM, and domain-based message authentication, reporting and conformance, DMARC. You'll be pleased to hear there's not an exam at the end of this presentation, and you don't need to know what they're really called. SPF, DKIM, and DMARC is sufficient, and everybody knows the initials if they're in the email industry. What we're going to do is tell you what they do. Okay, how to set them up. Okay, so SPF, in fact, all three of them are, to one extent, a entry in public DNS. Okay, so to do this, you need to have access to your public DNS zone and add stuff to it, and have good management of your DNS zone. I had a customer, it was yesterday actually, and we were ready to do some migration. We were ready to turn on migration for them. We went to turn it on, and it failed. And the reason it failed was we'd previously set up a bunch of DNS changes for them, including SPF. About a month ago, it was all working. We'd done all our testing. And in the last couple of days, they moved their domain host to somebody else and sent an out-of-date host file to the new company. And so everything we'd done in DNS the last month rolled back. There was poor management of DNS. And that has an implication here. You've got to have good management of DNS. You don't want to put this stuff in place and then find that someone else is changing it. Or you don't want to put this stuff in place and find, for example, that it's actually very difficult to manage DNS. I've got other customers. It takes days and days and days. I had one customer. It took months. They were government. It took months to make changes to DNS. And so you've got to have good management of DNS to start with, so you can do this easily and reliably, but also good management so it's not misused as well. You know, if someone got access to your DNS infrastructure authentication, they could add their own IPs to this and then send as you, and it would pass authentication. Okay? So you've got to be secure as well. So sender policy framework, SPF. It's a text record in public DNS that lists all the IP addresses from which I legitimately send email from my domain. Okay? And at the end of it, and we'll see some examples in a moment, I say how tight that will do, how tight I want to set the record. I can be quite loose about the record. I say, here's some IP addresses and there's more, or here's the IP addresses and there are no more. I can set it very tight. Okay? DKIM, to each message outbound that I send, I encrypt a little bit of the message headers and the message body, and I generate a message hash. I place the message hash in the headers, and I send the email. The recipient reads the message headers, the message body, creates their own version of the hash, and matches the hashes. Do the hashes match, in which case the message was not tampered with en route. And then DMARC, this can be used first for reporting. I can use DMARC to tell me where failures to DKIM and SPF are happening. But secondly, with DMARC, I can tell as the owner of the domain, and I set up the DMARC policy. As the owner of the domain, I can tell the recipients what I want them to do with failures. So I can say, okay, you got something that's outside my SPF range, or you've got something that failed DKIM. I want you to quarantine it. Okay? So rather than relying on the recipient's view as to what they are going to do with failures, I can tell them what I'd like them to do with failures to the message. And so that's the things we're going to look at here from the sender's perspective. So SPF, and here's an example of an SPF record at the top. Okay, it will always start V equals SPF1. It's a text record. Okay? And it will have things like an IP address. There's an IP address there. Actually, just noticed in my slides I've got a typo. It should say IP4 : in front of that. In fact, if you look at the second example below, that's correct. You can have include statements. So I can include the IP addresses of another organization. So I don't have to put all the IP addresses into my record. I can put my IP addresses into my record, and I can put someone else's IP addresses in. They manage their list, and I just include their list. Okay. So we do or the recipient rather does a DNS lookup for the SPF record, and they do a DNS lookup for every include, and they can do a maximum of 10 DNS lookups. Okay. The includes could contain includes, so there could be many DNS lookups, and if you go over 10, it fails. Okay. For example, look at the broken one below, the middle example on the screen. That's broken, okay. And you can tell it's broken. It's got too many lookups, because that's just what I was talking about. Okay. But you might go, well, why has that got too many lookups? Can you see? Just having a quick scan of that, I'll give you a moment. Have a read and see if you can work out why you think that might be broken. Okay. Now, I saw that at a client earlier in the week, and it had 14 lookups. Okay. And the problem there is they've got an include statement for spf.protection.outlook.com because their mail is in Office 365, but they also have an include statement for Outlook.com, which is Microsoft's consumer email system, and I don't know why they've got that in there. They don't send their email from Outlook.com, and so it shouldn't be in there. Outlook.com, their include statement, has 7 lookups in it. So this company, all they have to do to fix their SPF is to remove Outlook.com from their SPF record, and it will work. Okay. But a client of mine was receiving emails from the company that had this record, and it was all being quarantined. And the reason why it's being quarantined is they had a DMARC record that has quarantine, but they had an SPF record that was broken. Okay. So you've got to have all your technologies and have them all sorted and working well together. Second example on the list, near the bottom of the screen. Can you see what's wrong with that one? I'll give you a couple of seconds to have a look. There's two problems with that one, and there's one that you might think is a problem that isn't really. This came from the company whose DNS rolled back a month the other day as well. Okay, so the big problem here is there's no space after the include and before the compliance rule at the end. Okay, so it should say .com space tilde all in that case, and the space is important. You need space separating of each section. So that meant that that SPF record was invalid. The second problem they've got here is their Outlook, protection.outlook.com is an old record. In fact, it may even not be an old record. It might be pointing at their MX record rather than the SPF endpoint. And so that's wrong. There were a couple of entries for SPF includes over the last 10 years for Exchange Online that have changed over those 10 years. In fact, it's been spf.protection.outlook.com for a number of years now. But back many years, back to the early times of BPOS and Office 365, there were slightly different variations on it. And so sometimes you see those. They don't always work. They don't always work well. And so having the include statement correct. And so that would be the second mistake I would have on here. Okay. The one you might think is a mistake but isn't is the plus in front of the A, the MX, and the include. The plus just means include these within the in statement. You don't need the plus. It's more useful if you need the minus. So plus A is the same as A. Plus include is the same as include. Okay. So it's just extra characters and serves no purpose. Okay. So we build our SPF record. We include all of our senders, all of our legitimate senders in that, and we finish it in minus all. So for example, the last example, if it was working, is tilde all. That's like a soft SPF record. Not all of our possible IPs are included in this. There might be others. Okay. And so from the recipient's viewpoint, they're not always sure if it's a legitimate sender or not, because I haven't said who is fully responsible for my email. And so that's actually the hardest thing for SPF is getting down who my real senders are. Okay. And that's where DMARC comes into use, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do, let's mention DKIM. Okay. Again, it's text records in DNS, but it's also an Exchange server, or sorry, an email server that supports DKIM. because it takes, as we said earlier, the message body, some of the message headers, encrypts them with a private key, which the email server has, and adds the encrypted hash to a separate message header and sends the email. As long as the email is not tampered with en route and arrives at the receiver can reverse that, not by reversing the encryption because they haven't got the the private key, so they can't do that. But with the public key, they can do that. Well, certainly with the public key, they can take the message body, take the message headers, use the public key, and see if basically everything matches. Okay? And if the hash decrypted with the public key matches the message body and the message headers that have been used, then the message has not been tampered with en route. Of course, if the message has been tampered with en route, then you don't know how much has been tampered. And it does things within DKIM to protect against that. So, for example, you do your hash independent of line breaks. You do your hash independent of extra spaces and spaces and certain types of character return. But if the message has been broken down and rebuilt, or if the message has been tampered with, then DKIM will fail. For example, Mimecast will fail. It will pass DKIM when they're looking at it, but when they pass it on to Exchange Online looks at it and it always fails DKIM. Okay? It's because Mimecast breaks the message up into pieces and rebuilds it. And so a message going through Mimecast will never survive DKIM. And so Office 365 will always fail, will always mark DKIM as a failure. And that can be a problem if you put, and I'm not saying Mimecast are the only people that do that, if you put a filter in front of Office 365, those filters have got to be good on the way they treat email and not break it, for example. And that can be a problem. So that's what DKIM does. Okay. Make sure that the message has not been tampered with. DKIM is much better than SPF, more complicated, but it's much better than SPF for message forwarding. So for example, if I have an email and it comes into a server and gets forwarded to another server, then it will probably fail SPF because the forwarding server is not on, unless I know that it's forwarding intentionally for me, but let's say I don't know it's intentionally, it's forwarding for me. So the recipient is forwarding their email, for example. So I send an email to someone at Gmail, but they're actually forwarding it to their ISP. Okay? It'll arrive at their ISP, but it'll come from Gmail. That's the IP infrastructure that sent it, but my SPF record doesn't have Gmail listed on it, and therefore it'll fail SPF. DKIM, on the other hand, should survive forwarding. Obviously, if it goes through a system, as we just described, that breaks it, it's not going to survive, but it should survive forwarding. And I can look at the DKIM headers and decrypt it and so on and go, yes, this is the original message. It has not been tampered with, and so I can trust it. And then we have DMARC. Okay? Again, a text record. This one's at the _DMARC subdomain, okay, rather than the root as SPF is. Okay? And it tells your recipient what to do with SPF or DKIM failures. Okay? So we've got an example in the middle there. Okay? It's v_DMARC1 semicolon. So semicolons are used here to space the sections out, unlike SPF where spaces are used to separate them out. Each of these policies has been invented by a different group of people, and they seem to follow different rules. And the important one here is the policy, P equals, and in this case it's P equals quarantine. So if it fails DMARC, put it into your junk mail. If it fails DMARC, put it into your quarantine. So the recipient decides whether they're going to quarantine it or put it into junk mail. I mean, Exchange Online, that's a distinct difference. Quarantine is held up on the cloud, junk mail is in the mailbox. So you could choose where to put it. And we've got things like here, RUA and RUF, and they send reports to a mailbox, in this case, managed by a company called OnDMARC, and there are other providers as well. Okay. And another interesting one at the end of this is the SP policy, the subdomain policy. Okay. Now, let's say this was mbconsult.co's DMARC policy. Actually, it's very similar to the one that's currently in place. You could receive an email from mbconsult.co and it fails DKIM or it fails SPF. You would quarantine it because that's what the policy says, P equals quarantine. But let's say you received an email from, let's call it sales.mbconsult.co. So it's Brian at sales.mbconsult.co. Now, I don't use that domain. I don't have that domain created in DNS. How do I protect the domain that, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't exist, but as far as a spoofer is concerned, could use? They could send from the spoofed, they could spoof MB Consult by sending it from a subdomain. Okay? The DMARC record says policy quarantine. It could say policy none, for example, which is what it does say on my domain at the moment. SP reject. SP, the subdomain policy, says, well, if it's a subdomain of this domain that this record is in, reject it. Okay? And SP reject's really good because you probably don't have many, if any, subdomains for your email domain. And by saying SP reject, you're saying a blanket, all subdomains, because we don't know anything about them, all subdomains are rejected. Where you specifically have a subdomain that you know about, then you put a DMARC record on that subdomain. Okay? So for example, let's say I had a mailing service that sent from info@mail.nbconsult.co. So the subdomain here is mail, so @mail.nbconsult.co. I could have the bottom DMARC policy on the slide there, and that bottom policy would say, don't reject for the mail.nbconsult.co domain, but do reject for subdomains of the mail. Okay? So anything.mail.nbconsult.co would be rejected, but mail.nbconsult.co, where this DMARC policy is, would not be rejected. So at your very top level, in my case, nbconsult.co, so at the domain.com level, SPs reject, and at specific domains that you've got in use, you set the correct policy. But you have this SP reject, and so you blanket reject all domains that you're definitely not sending from. Okay, so there's our three technologies we've been looking at: DMARC, DKIM, and SPF. And so the email gets sent. Okay. It's time now to have a look at how the receiver can fix that, or be sure that who is receiving the email is a legitimate receiver of that message. Okay. So obviously, of course, things like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC can't fail. If it fails, then we're going to look at the message and we have to make a decision. Okay. Obviously, DMARC is going to help us make that decision, but we have to decide if it fails and why it's failed and if that's a good failure. Okay. So, for example, back a number of slides, we had a broken SPF record. Well, let's say that was the sender and then I was the receiver. It fails, I decide to put it into junk or quarantine. My users come to me and go, why is my customer's email going into junk or quarantine? How is the user going to know the difference between a legitimate email where the sender has broken their authentication and so it's getting junked, or spam, spoof, malicious email that is getting correctly junked but looks legitimate? And so to help, if you can be a good sender and get your authentication correct, you're going to help your company get their message and get their emails out, but also you have to, as a receiver, you have to help your users understand the difference on what's going on. So we've set up our legitimate senders, we've sent some emails and they've been received. How can we know if they're to be trusted or not trusted? Okay, well, that's where we look at those SPF, DKIM, and DMARC stuff, and that's how we tune our filters in our, of course, cloud-based anti-spam product. An on-premise box or no anti-spam product is just a bad idea nowadays. We need to be running through cloud ones that receive massive amounts of data so that they can make good decisions. If we have a little used cloud filter, they're not going to be able to make the decisions that we need them to make. The better companies is en masse, that the large organizations that do hundreds of millions of billions of messages, not necessarily in a day, maybe even an hour. So it's companies like that. They have a responsibility to get it right, of course. In the last couple of weeks, there was an issue. For example, at EOP, they started blocking emails that contained URLs to Dropbox. That wasn't wise. There some update, and Dropbox was marked as suspect, and then anybody who put a Dropbox, and there was a couple of others companies, links into messages that were being blocked. Okay? They reversed it and they redelivered the messages, and it was all done automatically in the background. But there are still problems, and we can't expect 100% uptime, 100% availability for stuff to work all of the time. But we need to be running a good filter that checks for that. Okay? And so what are our filters going to do? Well, from perspective of what we've had for many years now, spam, it either is or isn't, apart from the stuff that's in the middle, the gray area. Our cloud filters are great at this because they see so much, and they can make good decisions on this. The stuff in the middle tends to be where the sort of the gray area tends to be stuff where they don't have a good reputation maybe yet. So, for example, I've got on the slide there, a new IP by a sender may fall foul of a spam filter list because they appear spammy, because they appear to be sending from a new IP. You don't yet have the reputation to do that. Okay. I've got the ability to look at, let's take my picture off there, bulk spam. Okay. Low reputation, bad senders, known bad senders. Okay. Cloud filters can throw that away even before they make a decision on it. For example, it's like, we know you send rubbish, we know you send bad stuff, we know you send malware, or we know you come from, this is where some of the Microsoft Defender technologies are great, we know you come from an IP address that is sending malicious content, because we see in the Defender, in the antivirus and so on, that the Microsoft call their security graph, we see from our knowledge of the internet that IP is not a good sending IP. Okay. And so they'll do stuff like drop an edge. There's a report that you can get now from Exchange Online Protection that will tell you what was dropped at edge in terms of numbers. There's nothing else about it. It's when it passes that, it goes into the spam and the malware filters. Make sure your malware filters aren't telling users they've got malware for them. If it's detected as malware, if it was found as malicious, then it should be blocked and down to the administrator to release if it was a false positive. But it shouldn't be down to the user to release if it's a false positive. Goes into central quarantine, and there should be a way to check that and make sure it's released. Okay. The reporting tools we'll have a quick look at the end of this talk are quite good at telling us why it's malicious, what thing it it fell foul of, for example. So what malware it did find, why it was malware, what messages in, what other messages it was in. Okay. And they're quite good. And then back to our big topic of spoof and impersonation. It looks like the sender, but it may not be the sender. Okay. But of course it might be. So is it the sender? Is it not the sender? And they're the problems that we have to deal with. Okay. As I said already, it becomes hard when the senders get their authentication wrong and we, as the receiver, block it, or rather our cloud filter blocks it, and then we spend our time unblocking it and wondering why we needed to unblock it. Okay? And then maybe even trying to contact the sender and telling them they've made a mistake or they've got something wrong. So they're the sort of filters that our messages are going to be blocked by. Okay? And there's many other types of filters and other categories. For example, bad attachments or bad links, they can be filtered out as well. Okay? 0 day and stuff like that. But from a perspective of email, we should be protecting against all of those, of course, because email is a common way for data to get into our organization, and it's very easy for the users just to click on it regardless. Some people, their job is processing email that comes in. Click, read, do. Click, read, do. They're going to fall for a well-crafted or even not necessarily a well-crafted response. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the options that we can filter with. Okay, so we can put third-party filters. We mentioned them a few moments ago. We can put them in front of Exchange Online Protection. There's a number of them. Okay. Again, I recommend if you're going for ones, go for the bigger ones rather than the smaller ones. But don't go for them just because you've heard that Exchange Online Protection is rubbish. That's a story from 10 years ago. That's a story from 5 years ago. It's not a story from now. Okay. But just like any of them, if you go for, say, Proofpoint or Mimecast or Forcepoint or just EOP in front of your content, okay, make sure they're set up well. Make sure over time you keep them set up well. You could have any of the 3 other big ones I just mentioned. Barracuda is another one, Ironport from Cisco. But there's a number of them. But if you don't keep them maintained, if you don't keep them up to date, if you don't do your DKIM, SPF, and so on, then you may well have what you think is the best filter going. But if it's letting stuff through because you've got whitelists that are large and you've got open holes in your filter, you're not helping anybody. Okay? And so Don't put something in and configure it badly. Don't put something in and leave it so that it is eventually configured badly because it's just not maintained. These are important things to consider. Okay. Exchange Online Protection has a few settings now that allows you to roll out a standard or a strict setting to users. And Microsoft are in charge of what they think the settings should be. So the settings are really easy. You turn on standard or strict, strict for things like IT, finance, HR, executives, and those who are much more likely to be spoofed or impersonated, or have malicious content sent to them, like finance, to try and do business compromise email. And as Microsoft add new functionalities and they add new features, those get turned on for those users automatically. You don't have to maintain the system. Okay. Also, it's common practice in past times to put a third party in front and then turn off settings in EOP. There's now a bunch of stuff you can't turn off in EOP, and so you've got to get EOP configured correctly to know there's a setting in front of it. Okay? For example, skip known servers I've got listed there as my second item. Okay? You can go into Exchange Online Protection, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. You can go into Exchange Online Protection and say, in front of me, I've got Mimecast, or in front of me, I've got Proofpoint. And actually what you do is you go and say, I've got these IP addresses in front of me. Therefore, when you receive an email into EOP, look back through the message headers, skipping over all the Mimecast IPs, and then you'll see the original sender. I got a blog post on some of the IPs that are available for you for Mimecast, because actually, interestingly enough, they're not the IPs that Mimecast publish. Mimecast only send from 4 IPs if they're sending inbound to you, and not their massive range of IPs that they list. Their massive range is their cloud range, but they only send to you from 4 IPs. And so if you're going to, if inbound to you, outbound from you, they send from that whole range, but inbound to you, and as the receiver, that's all we care about. It's just 4 IPs. So you can go into Exchange Online Protection and you can say skip those 4 IPs because I have Mimecast in front of me. Okay. And so the message will arrive EOP and it will skip back through, there's only 1 IP per message, but it'll skip back through that IP and it will see the original sender, and then EOP can do its stuff. Microsoft can go, oh, we know that's a bad sender. Now, hopefully Mimecast knows it's a bad sender as well and have dropped it already, but in this example they hadn't, and so Microsoft could drop it. Okay. Rather than saying Microsoft, you're not allowed to look, and especially the stuff that you can't now turn off, like high confidence, phish and spam. You can't disable those settings, or edge block. Well, obviously edge block's not working if everything comes from Mimecast. You don't get to see the original IP. Well, with skip known servers, with enhanced filtering as it's called, we can skip the known servers in front of us. If we have one of my customers, for example, MX is to Proofpoint, Proofpoint to some on-premise Mailgate servers, Mailgate to Exchange Server to Exchange Online. What do you do there? Well, you skip the public IP of your Exchange Server platform. The Exchange Server internal IPs, it skips internal IPs anyway. Mailgate was internal, and you skip the public IPs of Proofpoint. So you can look beyond. Okay? Got an issue with Proofpoint in this case, though. Proofpoint puts their version of their filter, or the version of their software, into the received header. The version of their software looks exactly like an IP address. Okay? And so we set this up, and EOP was like, oh, the sender of that is 8.16.something.something. It wasn't. That was the version of Proofpoint we were running. Okay? So we had to include a skip for the version number because it looked like an IP address. I bugged that report to various people. Maybe that will go away. But that's something we found. Okay? Edge blocking we've talked about. Bad reputation and score. So maybe you're moving to a new sender, or you're opening up a new data center, and you're moving some servers to a new data center. And you've got a new IP. A good recommendation: send some stuff from the new IP and build up your reputation, rather than on Friday sending lots from the old IP and by Monday sending lots from the new IP. You might find a lot of stuff gets blocked because it's a brand new IP, or it's an IP that somebody else was using prior to you, and they had a bad reputation. Okay? So gain reputation, and then move your content, your massive content to it. And that's a good thing to do. If you're sending marketing email, do it from a dedicated IP that you buy as part of the service. Don't do it from the IP address that everybody else uses from the same marketing company. You will be affected by their reputation and not your reputation. We talked lots about spoof. Okay. At the bottom of that, I've got this entry about a display name impersonation. Okay. That's a problem, and that's not easily solved by things like SPF and DMARC. For example, a malicious sender could buy a domain. Let's call them hackersunited.com. Okay, they go and buy hackersunited.com, and they send an email from, and the display name is Brian Reed, and the email address is Brian at hackersunited.com. Lots of users, I won't say the majority, lots of users will say, oh, that's an email from Brian Reed. They won't look at the email address and go, well, it's not the Brian I've been dealing with in the past. Okay. And so we need technologies like built into Exchange Online protection, messages saying, this you've received from this user before. This is part of the Defender for Office 365 product. You've received from this sender before, but it's not the same sender. And it uses a thing called mailbox intelligence to do this. It knows who you sent to because it's looking at your mailbox. Exchange Online has access to your mailbox and knows who you've communicated with in the past. And then this looks like someone you've communicated with. Okay. So SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, they all pass for hackersunited.com. As we said, they're not hard to set up. So they pass, the email is legitimate, but its display name. And mobile phones are even worse at this because they've got a limited screen state. They tend to say it's from Brian Reed. Okay. Recently, the ability now exists to turn on a flag in Outlook Mobile, and it's coming soon to Outlook. It's also now working in OA, where you can display external next to a message. And you can externally in Outlook, the setting is called in Exchange Online, and it will come to Outlook soon. But you don't need those banners that you put in the body that lots of people put in saying, warning, this email is external. Okay? People tend to ignore them. That's the problem. They see them on everything. And of course, they affect the readability of the preview of your message. This will become native to Exchange Online if you turn it on. And then you can turn off those banners and modifications, okay, which of course are modifying your message and may have an impact on DKIM as well, okay, because they modified the message before it was looked at by EOP's DKIM, especially if you modify it in a third-party filter. So display name impersonation, but of course just impersonation of the email domains as well. This email looks like someone you've received an email from, but it isn't. Okay. And users will get stuff blocked. Okay. And they'll report it to the help desk. They won't know why. Okay. Why is this getting blocked? This was an important email, especially those ones. Politics, politics, politics. Shout, shout, shout. And it's like, oh, I'm going to release it. Oh, I'm going to whitelist it. Okay. That's often a bad idea. There may be times, for example, earlier in this talk, we had a couple of SPF records that were wrong. Okay. They were causing stuff to go into junk. Okay. And my recommendation is, apart from telling the company, okay, can we communicate with the company they've got something wrong? Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. Who do we talk to? Do we know who to talk to? We might not. Okay. But if we put them into a whitelist, an allow list, it might be good to say, okay, well, I'm going to come and review that in a month's time. It goes in and it stays in for a month. Okay. And so we don't have that technology in EOP. We might do in some of the third-party tools, but I would go and keep that list fluid and functional. I'd go and remove it if over time it didn't get fixed. It didn't get fixed. Maybe that company really doesn't care about their emails getting to their recipients. But we can. They might have just made a simple mistake, and they're going to fix it tomorrow. Okay? DNS gets cached and stuff like that. Okay? So we've got that. So we need to things to avoid whitelists. Okay. Certainly avoid whitelists where it says I'm going to allow that domain, because if that domain gets compromised or that domain itself gets spoofed or impersonated against, then you've got a whitelist that says that's going to come in, especially companies that you work with lots. So if you're expecting invoices in from a partner, okay, don't whitelist the partner. Make sure the partner has got their email set up properly, and if you do whitelist them, know where they send them from. So it's this user specifically, and only if they come from this IP address or infrastructure, not just that domain or not just that user. Because if your email is compromised or their email is compromised, and they start sending fish from another location, obviously it's compromised and they send it from there. That's a different problem. That's where we try and stop users being compromised by turning on MFA everywhere. That's a different talk. But if we have a whitelist that is just the domain, then we have a risk that if the domain is spoofed, then it's going to get through because we've allowed it through, and none of our other filters will apply because we've said allow this through. So be very careful about allow lists, and do come back and review them later if necessary. Okay. So that's the talk done. I've got a handful of minutes to finish off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop over to my browsers, and I'm going to talk you through some of the things that we can do to look at that. Okay. So let's start with the Explorer tool. Now the Explorer tool is new to Exchange Online Protection, and it's part of the Defender for Office 365 Plan 2 suite. Okay. Explorer allows me to explore everything about my email. Okay. If I haven't got the Plan 2 suite, then I won't have Explorer, but I will have a tool that allows me to look at my phish and malware. Okay, so it's not called Explorer, it's called Real-Time Investigations. Okay. What we're going to do here is effectively real-time investigations, because I'm not just going to go and look at all my email, but you may not have Explorer, but you will have real-time investigations. So it's under security.microsoft.com. Indeed, in the settings for security.microsoft.com, you can tell security.microsoft.com that all the previous portals that are now being replaced by security.microsoft.com will redirect to here. So for example, let's go to another tab. I've got the protection.office.com. Okay. Let's have a look at threat management and my policies. Well, I've turned on the setting that says if I go to anything that's now replaced by security.microsoft.com, it will auto redirect. Okay. So I go to threat policies. Oh, look, there we go. It redirects and takes me to security.microsoft.com and the same page, but in the central, a single unified portal. Okay. And so let's start here. Okay. We'll come back to Explorer in a moment. We've got enhanced filtering, for example. We talked about enhanced filtering. Let's go in there. I'll have here a connector, okay, inbound from Mimecast, okay, and I know what the 4 IPs are that Mimecast send to me from, okay, and I've got enhanced filtering turned on. Let's just click on that and see. I've got Mimecast EU, and so there's the 4 IPs. Look at my blog at c7solutions.com, and I tell you the others, and you can get them from the Mimecast documentation as well. Mainly you get them from looking at your emails, okay, and I can filter that to a small subset for testing, okay, but basically an email comes in from anybody, comes through Mimecast into my tenant, into my mailbox. EOP can look before Mimecast to see what's going on. Okay. I should do it for the 4 IPs for connected delivery and not for the full IP range. I had that turned on as well. I need to turn that off at some point because I don't need that turned on anymore. Okay. When I worked out it was just 4 IP addresses, as there's a problem if you do the full IP range when you have someone who sends from Mimecast and you receive from Mimecast. Okay. You look beyond Mimecast entirely, which means you look at the sending IP, and they may not have put that in their SPF record, but in fact they should have done if that's where they're sending from. And so I came across a number of problems if I put the full range in, okay. And I describe all that on my blog. Okay. So that's the enhanced filtering. Okay. Preset security policies we talked about. So we can go in and we can say a baseline that's suitable for most users and strict, and we set rules that say, these are the users that get the standard protection, these are the users that get the strict protection, and what those settings, and the settings are documented. Configuration analyzer, what's changed recently, what's been the drift over time. So I could go in and have a look and see what someone's changed. For example, configuration drift analysis history. Okay? And here it will tell me what someone's changed recently in the settings. Okay? And various things have been turned on, off, and whether that's a good increase or whether that was a decrease. Our general filters, anti-phishing, anti-spam, anti-malware. Let's look at the anti-phishing one. This is the one we talked about, the default policy. It's the one we talked about where we've got things like quarantine if it does display sender. And I've got a couple of domains that are doing display impersonation, and I need to let them through. And so the white list or the allow list here is just to allow them through impersonation. It's not to allow them generally. It's to allow them to get through this filter. Okay? And so that's an important thing as well. What filters are you allowing them through? Okay? And what to do with the messages that are detected as a spoof or quarantine or so on. Okay? And that's where, back to the configuration analyzer, That's where it's quite useful because it tells me if I've missed a setting or I've got a setting that's now considered weak. Okay. I can set up DKIM outbound for my custom domains. Okay. And then I get some reporting and other stuff on here. And so there's the various threat policies. Let's go and have a look at the Explorer. And that's from the sender side, some of that was from the recipient side. But from the recipient side, I could say any malware received. No, there wasn't any malware received. That's nice in the last, what was that, 2 weeks. But let's have a look at phish. And let's see what was received that was considered phish. Okay. And let's have a look at some settings. Let's narrow that down. Let's click on the calendar and let's have a look at the last 3 days just to make that a little bit easier. Okay. And to get around. Yeah. And so these are different hours. So I set that to 3 days. It's like, yeah, this is 1 day, next day, third day. Okay. I've tagged some accounts as priority accounts. Okay. And so, for example, we could tag the chief executive priority account. It highlights and looks at us and goes, yeah, stuff stuck here. That might be a problem. Okay. Okay. We can see where it was delivered to. Okay. Let's see if there's anything here for me briefly. There might not be. Yeah, there's one for me. So let's click on this. How we can improve the mental health, it says, for the workforce. Okay. It ended up in, who did it come from? It came from Luke at OFM News. Okay. And I'm a priority account as well. And I can look at things like the details of the message, inbound, why. Okay. It was a URL with malicious reputation. Okay. And it was spoofing or phishing an external domain. Okay. So possibly someone didn't get their SPF right. Sent it from a marketing agency, but didn't get their SPF right, for example. Okay. And so I can look, I can see where it was delivered to. Okay. And I can see the URLs in the message. Okay. Each of these URLs were clicked to make sure that by the system, to make sure that they weren't malicious of their intent. Watch out for that, because let's say you've got a password reset link that only works once. That's a bad idea. It should, work for, let's say, 24 hours until I reset my password. But it shouldn't not work just because it's been clicked once. Okay? So I had a couple of those where they get clicked and it breaks things. Not very many of them, but that's a price to pay. With I've got to check the links in the message and see if they're legitimate or not. Okay? And so a whole bunch of links there that are considered spam. Okay? Was there any attachments? And it'll give me information about them. Okay? It will even give me a screenshot of the attachment if it was it opened up a website or a link that opened up a website. I can see what it might look like if I was to open it. What devices I opened it on, when the email arrived, did anybody else get email as well? And at the top, I've got this email entity page. Okay? And this is the security portal, and there's a lot more information here. In fact, this is the one that will give me the photograph of the attachment. Okay? But it will tell me what rules it went through, what filtered it, and why, and I can get a lot more information about it. And this is in preview. Okay, but we see a lot more information. But we basically see very much the similar information we saw on the previous page. It's just much more nicely laid out. Okay. Okay. Were there any overrides? For example, why did something get delivered to the inbox when it was clearly spam? Override. It was in an allow list. We might find that where it was coming to, going from, and so on. Okay. And we got all the tabs, analysis. We got the message header. This is an older email. I probably deleted it in my junk mail, and so it doesn't exist. But if the message still existed in the mailbox it was put into, then I could get the headers from here and check them without having to go to the user and ask them for those. Okay. So what happened? It failed DMARC. Okay. So if I was to copy, for example, that domain and its lookup minus q equals text underscore DMARC and no DMARC record, or it says DMARC none. It doesn't. That looks fine. And if I look at the SPF record, there we go. There's an error in the SPF record. That's why that's not working. Okay? All is not a valid finisher. It's minus all or tilde all. Okay? And so that's why it's failed. It's failed DMARC because it's basically failed everything. Okay. And there is check, but of course I have to go and tell the company about that and block them. Okay. they also seem to be spoofing a domain that I receive emails for as well, which is UC Day Evolve Conference, and that's popped up on there as well. Okay, right, so we're at 50 minutes. That's our talk about what we should do as both the sender and the recipient, the things that we need to be aware of and the things that we need to check, and then how we can look that up and explore it and set our settings. Okay. So I hope that's helped you and benefited you in what you would like to look at next with regards to your email authentication and security. So my name is Brian Reed, and thank you very much for listening, and have a good day, and I hope you enjoyed the conference. Take care.